Thanks, Peter. And as we move into a general election, I'm starting to have flashbacks to early 1997. There was a fantastic programme on TV last week about the sort of great offices of state, and it had a programme about the Treasury. And I was slightly alarmed to see me in the queue clapping Gordon Brown walk into the Treasury. Thankfully, it was a sort of back head shot, so you couldn't quite see all of me, but it was definitely me, and I was definitely shaking hands with him, and I was definitely clapping. So if you didn't like the last 13 years, you can blame me. I want to cover some of the politics of the future of cities, and then get into some of the economic issues. I think the first thing to say about the TV debates that Tim was talking about is I understand that they're going to be taking place in Birmingham, Bristol and Manchester, so don't expect Clegg, Cameron and Brown to be camped out in London for their prepping up and their homework. There'll be an element of those debates which will be very much out in the country, so I think that's a good thing. Just on the sort of wider politics, I mean, the parties are obviously trying to draw dividing lines between themselves, and I think, I don't think this is going to sort of get into those debates necessarily, but I think for this audience, there are some pretty clear dividing lines between the two parties. If the Tories win a majority, and I still think that is going to happen, by the way, I think the hung parliament stuff will probably recede as we get into the real campaign proper, and I think the most likely outcome is a small but workable Tory majority. If that's the case, then a letter that Caroline Spellman and Ken Clarke wrote on Monday and circulated to Conservative colleagues means that, for the most part, regional development agencies will disappear and will sort of subdivide into local enterprise partnerships, unless the local authorities in a region want to keep a sort of regional body. And in the northeast, that's quite likely. Elsewhere, maybe apart from Yorkshire and Humber, it's perhaps less likely. So that's a big change, and that could very well be on the cards if the Conservatives win clear majority. I think on the planning front, massive dividing line. We've seen the Labour approach has very much been one trying to speed up the planning system with Kate Barker and all the rest of it. And what the Conservatives are setting out is a sort of plan to democratise the planning system. And, you know, their open source analogy is all very well, but as David Walliams on Little Britain says, well, the computer might say no if you go down the open source route, and that's the big risk of the Conservatives' plans. So I think some dividing lines there. Where I don't think there's much of a dividing line is actually on the deficit. I think there's a lot of politics being played now. We saw boxes up there about the Tories will cut earlier and deeper. I'm not convinced, actually. I think there's very little wiggle room in the fiscal year that we're about to enter into. There'll be some symbolic cuts early made by a Conservative government, but the big thing to keep your eye on is the spending review at the end of the year, October, November, and the big decision makers on that, quite frankly, are already inside the Treasury. It's Treasury officials who will be presenting a new government with some pretty scary numbers, and I can't quite see that either party is going to make that radical a different approach when it comes to consolidating on the fiscal side. So I can't see that dividing line there, but I can see some on planning and regional policy. Now, on the economics of what's facing UK cities, the big picture that the Centre for Cities has painted earlier this year is that of a very uneven recovery, and let me just explain that. Over the next few years, what's likely to happen is that Greater Manchester, the Leeds city region, the big conurbation around Birmingham, are just likely to get that bit more power, that bit more pooled budget. Tax increment financing is most likely to happen first in one of those three places, maybe the Aire Valley in and around Leeds. So for those who are interested in sort of innovative new ways of doing things, I'd be setting my sights on those big city regions outside of London, those three. For those who are worried about, you know, the Conservatives' plans in terms of incentives on council tax matching and planning, I think the places to really see those tested out are the more buoyant cities like Cambridge, Milton Keynes, Brighton. These are the places with high numbers of graduates, lots of businesses and big pressures on growth. And it's in these places that those open source plans need to work. If they don't work in places like Cambridge, Milton Keynes, they're very unlikely to work elsewhere. The third category of city are the ones that, next to you to come on, that perhaps I'm most worried about. There's a third category of city that is just too public sector. We heard Peter talk about this earlier with those take-up rates of commercial office in Liverpool. We're worried about cities that have between 30 and 40% of their employment base in the public sector. And those cities include Newcastle, Plymouth, Swansea, Ipswich, Leicester, Hastings. All of these cities have got a very high reliance on the public sector. Well, that's fine in the good times, not such a great idea if the Treasury is going to be cutting back on public spending. And so the prospects for those cities, and if you've got plans to develop in those cities, I think is pretty stark. The fourth category is, I think, the ones that we should really be worried about. It's where regeneration never was completed, it's where the recession has had the worst impact, and it's where you guys will find it most risky to take on new developments. And these are the struggling cities like Stoke, Barnsley, Burnley and Hull. These places have effectively been in recession for a very long time. In the decade running into the recession that we've just come out of, Stoke lost 20,000 private sector jobs. Burnley lost 7,500 private sector jobs in that 10-year period when the Treasury was bringing in lots of revenues. What is regeneration going to do for those sorts of places? How do the discussions that you're having today have an impact on those places? Just a final point on housing. We'll be bringing out a report later on this weekend. I think it would be in your interests to put the housing and the sort of new development story in context, and we'll be doing it on Saturday. If you imagine the country as a football pitch, only 1/3 of the centre circle is housing. Lots of people think that we're concreting over the entire country with housing, and that's why the Conservatives' plans on open source could run into difficulty. At the weekend, we'll be explaining there is plenty of land for new development on housing, and some of it lies, yes, in the green belt. Not all the green belt is a sort of picture postcard beautiful area that needs to be preserved in aspic forever. There are marginal bits of the green belt that could be developed, and yes, the brownfield target that has worked for the last 10 years should be revisited. So one of the issues I think the next government will need to grapple with, not just the fiscal position, is how we open up more new land for development, and I think that's a question that would be good to get your views on later. My question, Peter, for the panel is this, and it's relevant not only to the construction industry, the housing, the development industry, retail, etc. It is, in a sort of fiscally constrained economy as we go into the next Parliament, how can the next government stimulate more private sector jobs in our economy when far too many of our cities are dependent on the public sector? Thanks.